An arrow split the darkness and buried itself in the trunk beside his skull. Prince Eryndor did not move. He had already stopped believing he deserved to survive the night. Behind him, the men his own brother had sent were closing through the black pines, and the wolf inside his chest, the one the court called weak, the one they called silent, said nothing at all. No growl, no surge of power. Just a terrible, waiting stillness, as if his wolf were listening for something the hunters could not hear. A shape stepped out from between the trees, not a soldier. A woman, bow still raised, an arrow already knocked toward the man who had been 3 steps behind Eryndor a moment ago. The man was on the ground now, and he was not getting up. She did not lower the bow all the way when she looked at Eryndor. She looked at his shaking hands. She looked at his boots, ruined and sunk in mud, and at the torn royal cloak clinging to his shoulder where the blade had opened it. "You do not look like a king." Eryndor forced air into his lungs. "Good. Kings die faster." She almost smiled at that, though it did not reach her eyes, and when she finally turned to lead him deeper into the trees, his wolf rose for the first time all night, not to challenge her, not to claim the path, but to follow the sound of her footsteps as though it already understood something he did not. Her name was Kaela Thorn, and neither of them yet knew how much that walk into the dark would cost them both. She moved through the forest as though the trees themselves had agreed to hide her, choosing footing that left no mark, avoiding the soft earth that would hold a print until morning. Eryndor tried to match her pace and failed twice, his boots catching on roots he could not see in the dark, and each time she stopped without a word and waited, never impatient, never gentle either. "Keep your steps light. A prince who walks like a soldier will get us both killed." He wanted to argue that he had trained with soldiers his entire life, that he knew how to move quietly when it mattered, but the truth was he had trained to be seen, to be measured, to be judged against brothers who wanted every eye in a room on them. He had never trained to disappear. She, it seemed, had trained for little else. 6 hours earlier, the Alpha King of Thornvale had been alive. By midnight, he was not, and the great hall had become a battlefield of ambition dressed as mourning. Eryndor had tried to speak sense into the council, had tried to say that no successor should be crowned before the border reports were verified, that soldiers were still missing along the eastern line, and no one seemed to care. No one listened. His brother Malrec did not need to argue. Malrec simply let his wolf roar, and the sound rolled through the stone hall like a physical wave, driving grown warriors down onto one knee without a single word spoken. Eryndor's wolf had never made a sound like that. It never rattled the doors of a room. It never forced a soldier's spine to bend. In a court that measured worth by the force of a roar, Eryndor had a wolf that only listened, and for that they had a name for him, Omega Prince. Malrec crossed the hall slowly, savoring the silence he had created, and stopped close enough that only Eryndor could hear him. "You still think kindness can wear a crown?" Eryndor said nothing. There was nothing to win by answering, and some small, exhausted part of him wondered if his brother might be right. By the time the soldiers came for him in the night, dressed as loyalists cleaning up loose ends, Eryndor was already running, and he was not entirely sure he was running toward anything worth saving. He was the youngest of the king's sons, born into a family that measured worth in decibels, in the width of a shoulder, in the number of enemies a single glare could send retreating. His brothers had spent their boyhoods sparring in the training yard, breaking each other's noses in the name of discipline, learning to make grown men flinch with nothing more than a lowered brow. Eryndor had spent his boyhood somewhere else entirely, in the granary counting sacks of barley against a hard winter, in the map room memorizing which mountain passes closed first with snow, in the kitchens learning the names of every widow whose husband had died serving a war she never asked for. The court found it charming. At first, the way a court finds anything charming right up until it becomes inconvenient. His father, a man who wore his crown the way other men wore armor, had once placed a hand on his shoulder with something almost like affection, and said the words that would follow Eryndor for years afterward. Kindness is a good trait in a spare son. It was not cruelty, not exactly, but it carved something into him regardless, a quiet certainty that whatever gentleness lived in him was a flaw to be tolerated rather than a strength to be used. When the old king finally died and Malrec seized the hall with a single roar, Eryndor did not run only because he feared for his life. He ran because some small, exhausted part of him agreed that perhaps the court had been right about him all along. Now, deep in unfamiliar woods, he followed a woman who had killed a man to save a prince she clearly did not respect. The camp Kaela led him to was little more than a collapsed hunting shelter, its old canvas patched with bark and moss, hidden behind a frozen stream she had waded through twice to cut their scent trail. She worked in near total silence, packing mud along the edges of his wound, listening every few minutes for birds that had gone quiet in the wrong direction. "Why did you save me?" Kaela did not look up from his shoulder. "I did not save a prince. I stopped my brother's soldiers from selling one more road to men who would burn it." Eryndor did not understand yet what she meant by roads, but something in the flatness of her voice told him this was not the first time she had bled for that word. He noticed, when the firelight caught her boots, that they were road-worn in a way that spoke of years, not seasons, and that beneath the mud on her jaw was a thin white scar shaped almost like a forked path. "What were you before this?" For a long moment she said nothing, and he thought she would not answer at all. "A border scout, the best one Thornvale had, until your brother decided the truth I found was more dangerous than the men selling it." She did not explain further that night, and Eryndor was too tired, too raw, too uncertain of his own right to ask more questions of a woman who had just saved his life, to push. His wolf, however, did not stop watching her. It did not try to claim territory in that small camp. It did not push forward to prove strength the way Malrec's wolf might have. It simply lay near the entrance, ears angled toward her every movement, learning the rhythm of her breathing the way a traveler learns a road he intends to walk again. She noticed. Of course she noticed. But the last time a wolf like his had looked at her with anything resembling loyalty, it had belonged to men who called her a traitor once her usefulness ran out, and she was not eager to make that mistake twice. A bond that could not follow the wounded home had no right to call itself fate, and until she saw otherwise, that was exactly what she believed a prince's bond would be. She had been a border scout once, the best Thornvale ever trained, able to read a season's worth of danger in a single broken branch or a patch of trampled grass. She had loved the work the way some people love a language only they can read, the quiet poetry of knowing which stream ran safe in spring, which pass turned deadly after the first snow, which path a frightened family could take without ever crossing a patrol. She had reported what she found along the border months before the old king died, evidence of passes sold to men who spoke a language no Thornvale soldier recognized, evidence that pointed directly at a prince the court adored too much to suspect. The court had not believed a scout over a prince. They rarely did. She had been stripped of her title, her home, her name inside every pack record that mattered, and sent into exile with nothing but the curse, that had already begun to settle into her skin, a punishment she never fully understood until the first time she guided someone down a road they did not respect and felt it open a line of fire beneath her feet. She had learned, in the years since, to trust very little and to hope for even less. And the last thing she needed was another royal son convinced that a bond in his chest excused whatever came next. The days that followed carried them through packs. The royal maps did not bother to draw accurately, and it was there, far from the throne room, that Eryndor began to understand what kind of ruler he had never been trained to be. The first was Hunger Pack, a scatter of huts built on soil too dry to feed the people who worked it, where a boy named Leo, no older than 8, split his own half-bowl of thin porridge and pushed part of it toward the exhausted stranger without being asked. Eryndor tried to refuse. The boy's mother only shook her head, because refusing hospitality here was its own kind of insult, and Eryndor forced himself to eat what a hungry child had offered him. Later, Kaela showed him the supply road that ran past Hunger Pack's fields, a road that used to carry grain from the royal stores in winter, before Malrec quietly redirected it to feed a private army instead. Eryndor, still raw with guilt, said the first thing that came to him, "When I am king, I will make this right." Kaela's expression did not soften. Hungry wolves cannot eat promises. His wolf lowered its head at that, not in submission to her, but in something closer to shame. And for the first time, Eryndor understood that leadership was not a thing you announced. It was a thing you delivered, in grain and boots and blankets, long before anyone owed you their loyalty for it. The second stop was Widow Pack, where the war his father had once called a triumph had left behind rows of empty armor polished by hands that no longer had anyone to polish it for. An old woman named Mara received him in a house crowded with the ghosts of men who never came home, and she asked him plainly how many soldiers had died in his father's final campaign. Eryndor gave her the number from memory, the number etched into every royal record. Mara gave him something the records never held, names, each one attached to a wife, a child, a debt no crown had ever repaid, and by the time she finished, Eryndor's throat had gone too tight to speak. A king who counts only soldiers will never know what war costs. She led him through the house, past armor stands holding breastplates that would never again fit a living shoulder, past a child's drawing pinned to the wall, a crude sketch of a father in uniform, standing beside a house that no longer existed. That one was drawn the week before we learned he was not coming home. His daughter still asks when the war will let him go. Eryndor had no answer that would not sound hollow in that room, and he did not try to offer one. He simply stood there and let the weight of it settle into him, let himself feel, for the first time, the true shape of a victory his father's court had once celebrated with feasts and songs. No song had ever mentioned this house. Outside the door, Kaela stood with her jaw tight, because Widow Pack was a place where too many roads had once led men away and never led them back, and the old ache beneath her skin recognized every one of them. She did not yet tell him why that mattered so much to her, but that night, when the cold came in hard and the fire burned low, Eryndor noticed she favored her left foot when she walked, and he slowed the group's pace without a word, so she would never have to admit she was in pain to ask for rest. She noticed that too. She said nothing about it, but something in her chest shifted slightly, in a way she was not yet ready to name. The third stop, closer to the border than either of them wanted to admit, revealed the proof neither of them could unsee. Border Captain Sen showed Eryndor the moved stone markers, the quietly rerouted patrols, the emptied weapons cache, and fresh wheel ruts crossing a border pass that should have been sealed since the last war, All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Malrec had sold Thornvale's border secrets to buy himself a private army loyal only to him. Because princes smell like truth when scouts smell like mud, Sen's words landed like a blade, and Kaela turned away before Eryndor could see her face, but he saw the mark on her ankle flare, red beneath her bootlaces, a thin, raised scar that looked freshly torn, though nothing had touched it. He did not ask about it yet. He simply understood, without being told, that this was not the moment to demand her secrets, and he let the silence between them be its own kind of respect. That silence lasted until the night everything he had learned nearly cost them everything. Word reached them of a small outpost holding a portion of Malrec's stolen border maps, lightly guarded, isolated, close enough to reach before dawn. Kaela laid out every reason it was too dangerous. They did not know if hostages were inside. They did not know the retreat routes. They did not know if reinforcements were a mile away or 10. They did not know if it was a trap built specifically to catch a prince desperate to prove himself. Eryndor, exhausted by months of being called weak, exhausted by a crown he had never wanted but could not stop being measured against, made the choice anyway. He gave the order to move before first light. For a few brief, blinding minutes, it looked like it might work. Then, the outpost's true purpose revealed itself, and the trap closed around them. Scout Neva was taken before anyone could reach her. 2 of their own were wounded badly enough that retreat became a fight in itself. And the only way out ran through a flooded underground channel that Kaela knew, but had never wanted to use, because it was steep enough to open old wounds, and it did exactly that. By the time they surfaced half a mile downstream, soaked and shaking, blood had soaked through the wrapping on Kaela's foot, the mark beneath it torn wide open in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a map with a road erased from it. Eryndor reached for the recovered documents, meaning to say something about the ground they had gained. Kaela threw the papers into the mud. You wanted a victory. A king should have wanted everyone back. He had no answer for that, because she was right, and the silence that followed was heavier than any wound either of them carried. That night, in a shallow cave lit by a fire too small to be seen from a distance, Eryndor watched her stitch her own foot with hands that would not stop trembling, and he finally understood what the mark truly was. It was not decoration. It was not a scar from an old injury. It was a living curse, one that cut into her whenever a road was used by someone who did not understand or did not care what that road would cost the people walking it. Worse than the pain, she told him quietly, staring at nothing, was what came after. Every misused road stole one path from her memory, one hidden trail, one safe crossing, one shortcut she had once used to carry a dying child through the snow, simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. Continue like this, and eventually there would be no roads left inside her at all, only silence where a guide used to be. I am sorry. Kaela did not look up from the needle. An apology does not bring Neva back. Eryndor sat with that, letting it settle instead of flinching away from it, because flinching had always been his family's way of avoiding the truth, and he was done inheriting that particular habit. Then, tell me what would. Kaela finally looked up from her stitching, studying him with an expression he could not quite name, something between exhaustion and the first faint edges of respect. Patience, the kind that outlasts your pride. Eryndor wanted desperately to move at once, to charge back toward the outpost and undo what his impatience had caused. Kaela asked him, evenly, exactly how. With what plan? Along what retreat route? Who would protect Hunger Pack from retaliation while they were gone? Who would warn Border Pack that Malrec now knew they had allies? Who would care for the wounded if the rescue failed as badly as the attack had? He had no answers, and for the first time, he did not try to force one just to feel like a king again. He sat with the silence instead, and let it teach him something the roar of his brother's wolf never could. Regret was not allowed to become another rushed decision wearing a different face. That night, he did not ask for her forgiveness again. He simply ground the bitter root she used for pain into paste the way he had watched her do for others, and set it beside her without a word, without expectation, and let her choose whether to use it. She used it. Neither of them spoke of what that meant, but something between them had quietly shifted its shape. Days later, it was Kaela's turn to make a choice that would cost them just as much. She learned that Malrec's forces were closing in on a portion of Border Pack, preparing to take them as leverage, and that the fastest way to reach them in time ran directly through a place called Widow's Hollow. She knew that road. She had watched an army once use that exact route, meant only for evacuation, meant only for saving lives, and turn it into an invasion path instead, leaving villagers dead in a crossfire they never should have been near. She looked at Eryndor, a prince who had already proven, only days before, that ambition could override caution when a crown was calling. She chose to hide the road rather than risk watching him repeat that same mistake with a road she alone still remembered clearly enough to protect. They took the long way instead. They arrived too late. Part of Border Pack was already in chains by the time they reached them, and there was no version of what happened next that did not begin with that failure. Eryndor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Now you chose for them too. The words hit harder than any accusation shouted in anger ever could have, because they were true, and Kaela had spent so long believing that keeping the roads to herself was the only way to keep them safe, that she had never questioned whether that instinct could fail people just as badly as reckless ambition could. I kept the road from you because I feared what princes do with roads. It was not an excuse, and she did not offer it as one. It was the first time she had said the truth of her fear out loud, and admitting it cost her something she was not used to giving away. Eryndor did not use her confession as a weapon, though he could have, though a lesser man raised in that same court might have. Instead, he asked her a different question, quiet and direct. Who else needs to know this road exists so no one ever has to guard it alone again? Kaela had no immediate answer, but something about the question settled into her chest differently than anything else he had said since the night she pulled him out of the pines. It was the question of a man who did not want the road for himself. He wanted it kept safe for everyone who might need it. Their path eventually led them to a settlement that did not appear on any Thornvale map at all. A scattered camp of scouts the court never trusted, Omegas cast out of their birth packs, deserters who had refused to kill civilians, and children who belonged fully to no pack because the roads that once connected them to their families had been erased or forbidden. The camp itself told its own story before anyone spoke a word, cookfires arranged in careful circles so smoke would not betray their position. Children's boots lined neatly by size outside a tent clearly shared by families who were not related by blood but had become something like it anyway. Kaela moved through the camp with a familiarity that surprised Eryndor, nodding to faces she clearly recognized, and he realized, watching her, that this was not the first time she had walked this road. It was simply the first time she had brought a prince down it. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Bran, watched Eryndor approach with open suspicion. The kingdom calls us roadless wolves. We are the ones who remember the roads it once forgotten. Eryndor did not ask them to kneel. He did not ask them to swear loyalty on the spot, the way every prince before him had been trained to demand. He asked them what they would need, if Thornvale survived what was coming, in order to walk home without being treated as criminals for the crime of having been erased. Bran studied him for a long moment before answering. "Don't let us come back as prisoners." It was a small sentence, but it planted something enormous in Eryndor's mind, the outline of an idea that had nothing to do with armies or thrones, and everything to do with roads that belonged to more than just the crown. A kingdom needed more than paths built for soldiers marching forward. It needed paths built for people finding their way home. With Neva still held and Border Pack hostages still in chains, the plan they built together looked nothing like the reckless strike Eryndor had once ordered alone. This time, he did not ask how fast they could win. He asked who needed to come home, who could not run, who remembered the old paths, who could carry grain, who could guide the children, who would stay behind to hold a distraction, and who among them had earned the right to say no to any part of the plan at all. Kaela watched him ask those questions one by one and recognized, with something between relief and quiet astonishment, that the man beside her had actually changed. Hunger Pack moved grain along the dry roads to keep the rescued fed. Widow Pack hid the wounded inside mourning carts no soldier would think to search. The exiled scouts opened trails the royal maps had never recorded. Border Pack lit signal fires along the ridge to draw attention where it was needed and away from where it was not. Eryndor's wolf, silent as ever, moved ahead of the group, listening for fear in the wind rather than for enemies to fight, guiding them wide of anywhere hostages might be held. And Kaela, for the first time since her exile, opened Widow's Hollow herself, not in secrecy, not out of fear, but in front of every pack that had gathered, with one condition spoken clearly enough for all of them to hear. This road existed to bring people home. It would never again be used to take a kingdom by force. The rescue succeeded where the earlier attack had failed, not because Eryndor's wolf finally learned to roar, but because an entire network of roads, remembered by people the crown had spent years trying to erase, refused to let anyone be left behind. Neva came home. So did every hostage taken from Border Pack. But the true battle, the one that would decide whether any of it mattered, still waited at the gates of Thornvale itself, where Malrec sat on a throne built from a roar loud enough to silence a room, and Kaela understood. Standing at the edge of the trees, with her people finally gathered behind her, that the next choice belonged to her alone. She could lead this quiet alliance in a direct assault, matching Malrec's stolen army with the strength of every pack he had underestimated. It would likely work. It would also mean becoming exactly the kind of leader who used roads as weapons, the very thing she had spent her exile trying to protect people from. She chose differently. She gathered the evidence Border Captain Sen had shown them, the moved markers, the rerouted patrols, the wheel tracks crossing a border that should have been sealed, and paired it with something no document could ever carry. Living witnesses. Lyo from Hunger Pack, whose family had gone without grain for a private army no one voted for. Mara from Widow Pack, with a list of names the royal records had never bothered to keep. Sen from Border Pack, who had watched his own patrol routes rewritten by a man who called scouts liars for the crime of finding the truth first. Bran and the roadless wolves, who had spent years surviving on paths a kingdom pretended did not exist. When Thornvale's court gathered beneath its high stone arches, expecting a battle for the throne, Kaela did not lead soldiers through the doors. She led witnesses. Malrec's wolf tried to answer the moment with the only weapon it had ever needed, and the roar that once brought grown warriors to their knees rolled across the hall exactly as it always had. No one knelt. Because for the first time, the people standing in that hall had already walked roads that taught them. A roar was not the same thing as the truth. Eryndor stepped forward, and every eye in the hall braced for his wolf to finally rise and answer his brother's challenge the way the court had always demanded. It did not roar. It stayed exactly as silent as it had always been, and instead of power, Eryndor offered something the throne room had never once required of a prince. He asked Malrec, in front of the entire court, to explain the wheel tracks crossing a sealed border pass, the missing weapons cache, the rerouted patrols that conveniently avoided the very smuggler's route Sen had mapped. Malrec's roar had no answer for evidence. He tried anyway, insisting the wheel tracks belonged to merchants, that the missing weapons had been moved for repair, that a scout's word had never been worth trusting, and nothing had changed, simply because a prince stood beside her now. But the hall was no longer made only of nobles, trained to accept whatever a roar declared true. It was full of people who had walked the very roads he claimed did not exist, who had counted the grain he stole, buried the names he never learned, and carried children through the winters his private army had made harder than they needed to be. A roar could silence a room. It could not silence 100 witnesses who had already decided they were done being quiet. Malrec's eyes swept the hall, and when he understood the roar was no longer enough, he tried the only other language he knew. A kingdom is not held by roads. It is held by fear of the wolf at the center of it. No one knelt this time either. It was Kaela who delivered the final blow, not with a blade and not with her bow, but with the map itself, the true one, marked with every stolen road, every redirected supply line, every border sale Malrec had made to buy the loyalty currently standing behind him in that hall. She laid it before the assembled packs and asked a single question. Which of you still wants to follow a road built on selling the rest of us? One by one, the soldiers Malrec had gathered through fear and false promises lowered their weapons, because a kingdom built on a roar can survive many things, but it cannot survive its people finally seeing the truth laid bare in front of them. Malrec's reign ended not in a battlefield, but in a hall full of witnesses he could no longer silence, and the guards who dragged him from the throne did so, on the order of the packs he had spent years starving, not on the order of a prince finally proving he could roar loud enough to take his place. In the sudden hush that followed, something impossible happened. The old wound on Kaela's foot, torn open again and again across every misused road of the last few months, stopped bleeding. For the first time since her exile, the road beneath her feet did not cut her for leading someone forward. It simply let her stand. The road did not forgive her, but it stopped bleeding through her alone. Eryndor did not reach for a crown first. He turned to the packs who had carried them through every mile of that journey and asked what they needed to walk home without fear of ever being erased again. What followed was not a coronation built around a single throne. It began not with a proclamation from the throne, but with a long table dragged into the center of the great hall, around which every pack leader who had once been dismissed as too small, too poor, or too far from the capital to matter was finally given a seat. Laio's mother spoke for Hunger Pack and asked for grain routes that could never again be quietly redirected without every pack knowing why. Mara spoke for Widow Pack and asked that no campaign ever be declared a victory again without first accounting for every name it cost. Sen spoke for Border Pack and asked that no border pass ever be altered without 3 packs, not 1 crown, agreeing to it. Bran spoke for the roadless wolves and asked simply that no one be erased from a map again for telling the truth too early. Eryndor listened to every request without once trying to soften it, without once explaining why a crown might find it inconvenient, and when the table finally fell quiet, he asked only one question in return. "What do you need from me to make sure this outlasts me?" It was that question, more than any coronation, that convinced the packs gathered in that hall to trust the charter being written in front of them. Because it was the first time in Thornvale's long history that a ruler had asked to be held accountable by the very people he was meant to serve. It became the founding of something Thornvale had never had before, a charter guaranteeing that every road connecting its packs, forgotten or not, belonged to the people who walked it, protected from ever again being sold, hidden, or turned into a weapon by whoever happened to be sitting on the throne. Eryndor himself asked for the first line to be carved above the hall doors, where every future ruler of Thornvale would have to walk beneath it before ever reaching the throne. No crown may claim a road it cannot bring its people back through. They called it the Road Crown Charter, and its first and only guardian was chosen not by bloodline, but by every pack whose survival had depended on her memory of paths the kingdom had tried to erase. Kaela Thorn became the first road warden of Thornvale, sworn not to a prince and not to a crown, but to every road that still needed someone to remember its cost. Eryndor found her that evening on the ridge above the packs that were finally, quietly, beginning to rebuild. And he did not reach for her hand the way a prince claiming a mate might once have done. He simply stood beside her, close enough to be near, far enough to leave the choice entirely hers. "I am not asking you to be my Luna." Kaela turned to look at him, something unguarded finally showing through the exhaustion on her face. "Then what are you asking?" "I am asking if the road between us is one you would ever choose to walk again, on your own terms, at your own pace, for as long as it takes." For a long moment she said nothing, watching the fires of Hunger Pack and Widow Pack and Border Pack and the roadless wolves all burning steadily along the valley below, no longer scattered, no longer forgotten, no longer without a way home. Then she reached out, not for a crown and not for a claim, but simply for his hand, the way one traveler reaches for another, before a long road still waiting ahead of them both. A king, she had learned, was never the one who reached the throne first. He was the one who remembered which road led his people home, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Kaela Thorn did not walk that road alone. Eryndor had once believed he was too quiet to be king, but Kaela taught him that a crown did not need the loudest wolf. It needed the one who could hear the people still walking home. He did not become Alpha King by making the kingdom kneel. He became king by learning every road a frightened wolf might need to return.